All right. So once again, welcome to the Winter Climate Outlook webinar. As you can see, we had a nice snow event that many of you probably remember down there in San Antonio back in January of 1985. And obviously that's one of those type of events that doesn't happen real often, and we're not expecting it to happen this year, but it did happen during La Niña year. So just thought I'd point that out as we get started. So as you take a look at the 90 and 180-day rainfall, you can see that fall was quite a bit drier than normal, except here in the Rio Grande Plains. Most spots, in some cases, were less than 50% of normal. But as we went back to the 180 days, we still have our wet summer that is having a strong effect there. So we've got not just wetter than normal conditions in the Rio Grande Plains, but also several spots in the I-35 and 37 corridors. Most areas were that were not above normal were within 75 to 25% of normal. So we don't have, significant short-term dry conditions across the entire area, but there are some areas, particularly here in the Winter Garden region, where you do see some short-term dryness, and over here in parts of the coastal plains. So what we've had is we've had drought and D0 conditions, which is essentially our abnormally dry conditions, but not quite yet the drought that is meant for D1 and above, has expanded across the state from what was just about 10% back at August 30th to now about 33% on November 29th, the outlook that just came out today for November 29th. And so what you see here is that for our entire region, we have mostly just normal conditions and abnormally dry conditions over some areas east of I-35. But you do see we do have about 4 counties in the Winter Garden region that do have parts of them that are technically in drought. And so hopefully the rains that we're expecting this weekend will help to eliminate some of that, but if it does not, then that will continue to occur across the region. Our drought concerns are expected to increase this winter. As you can see from the seasonal drought outlook, most areas that are along and east of I-35 and really the hill country, areas that don't currently have drought, they're expected to have drought develop over the next 3 months. Now, obviously, it's probably not going to happen in the next week or two with the rainfall we're expecting this weekend, but overall for the whole winter, it does mean that we are expecting drier normal conditions as a whole, and therefore, because the drier normal conditions we had in spring, that'll start to show up in our 4, 5, and 6 month drought blends that we look at for determining drought. Of course, 6 to 14-day outlooks show that we have cool and dry conditions that are generally expected across the region as we move forward. Obviously, this weekend is going to be pretty cool and rainy, but once we move past that, we do have a brief warm-up on Monday, Tuesday, and then we have another front coming through the second half of next week. And because of northwest flow aloft, we're going to typically be on the backside of a trough, so we should remain dry and should remain a little bit cooler than normal. So that looks like it's probably in pretty good shape. As we move forward to 3 and 4 week outlooks, one thing I want to point out about this, I don't think I've shown this in a while, but for our 3 and 4 week outlooks, they come out on Fridays between 2 and 3 p.m. And so this is actually the outlook from last Friday for December 10th and 23rd. So tomorrow's will be for the 17th until the 30th. But we do expect that in general, they probably will maintain these drier and warmer than normal conditions for the most part over the region moving forward. Once we get past the next couple of weeks. It's still kind of difficult to tell what that will look like once we get past mid-December, but that has generally been what Climate Prediction Center has been doing. But if you want to see what they do, make sure you take a look at that between 2 and 3. And one thing to point out about these is unlike the other outlooks that use 3 different categories where they have above normal, below normal, and equal chance, the equal chance here just means that they don't feel like there's enough skill for them to predict that in those areas. And so these areas, as you can see up here in the Montana area, have above normal chances of above normal precip, whereas most of the southeastern United States and Texas has below normal chances of has a chance of below normal precipitation for weeks 3 and 4. But everywhere else, just not a strong enough signal to look at that. So that's one difference that occurs between that and the other outlook, which actually does have skill when they say equal chance of above or below normal conditions. For the long-term outlooks, you can see that December is actually now changed a little bit to where they have equal chance of above or below normal conditions for our western areas And then for our eastern areas, actually odds are slightly tilted towards above normal rainfall chances. And that is mainly because of the rainfall that we're expecting this weekend will be enough to get us to normal for many locations for the entire month, even if it didn't rain again for the rest of the month, because our normals usually are about 2 inches or below for most of the region. When you look at temperatures, equal chance, because we know that the next 10 to 15 days in general are going to be below normal, expecting the next 15 days or so to be above normal, so that gets us somewhere in the normal regime. When you look at precipitation, though, and temperatures for the entire 3-month period, we're still maintaining that below normal chance, that below normal precipitation, and odds tilted towards above normal temperatures, and actually strongly tilted towards above normal temperatures. So that has not changed, given that we are technically looking at weak La Nina conditions, or very borderline ENSO neutral to weak La Nina conditions. And so as you take a look here at our weekly departures, we actually have all of our locations in the equatorial Pacific and the central and eastern Pacific have actually risen back above negative 0.5 degrees Celsius for the current weekly instantaneous temperature. But one thing to point out there is that on average for August through October, they were actually met that threshold of the negative 0.5 degrees Celsius. They're at negative 0.7. That's the second of 5 months that has met that threshold. One change between the last time I gave the talk back in mid-October and now is that back in mid-October, you kind of saw some higher magnitudes of what we had then in terms of having more negative, even some -1 anomalies here, but they weren't necessarily spread across the entire central and east Pacific. Now they pretty much have spread across the central and east Pacific, but for the most part, the amount of their magnitudes, or how much they are below normal, is not that much. And so we are kind of beginning to see some increases, even though the sea surface temperature signal that's below normal has broadened. So there is some uncertainty with whether or not we're going to reach that 5-month criteria that we would need to be an official La Nina. So that would mean we would have to get through the December, January, February average period of having that threshold. And so we're definitely going to have it for the next 3-month average threshold. But to get 2 more past that is kind of a question mark. And as you can see, looking at different sets of models up here, a lot of the dynamical models actually show that we will stay below that negative 0.5 degree threshold through December, January, February, whereas some of the statistical models do not. And when you look at the CFS model, you can see that for the most part, it's pretty evenly split between getting to December, January, February neutral and staying in weaker, moderate La Nina. But all models pretty much show us gradually having sea surface temperatures increasing well into the ENSO neutral category for most of spring as we go in deeper into 2017. So therefore, the Climate Prediction Center is predicting a 55% chance the La Nina will persist through this winter, and there's a 60 to 65% chance that we will definitely be in ENSO neutral this spring, and I would anticipate that that's probably going to go up in their next outlook or two. How does La Nina affect our weather? Well, as you know, typically we have a pretty active subtropical jet in the wintertime, but when we do have La Nina, except of course for a week like this week, where we're going to have a nice deep trough over the western areas moving through our region, we typically don't get a lot of storm tracks that move through the region. A lot of times you get this blocking high pressure over here in the Pacific that causes a northward displacement of a lot of our storm systems, and we get a southern branch of the polar jet that remains north of the region. So for the most part, that keeps our cold air intrusions down and keeps our opportunities for precipitation down over the region, which is why we typically are drier than normal and warmer than normal in winter. But to break this down further, what you see here is this line is our average temperature for December to February between 1981 and 2010, which is usually 54 degrees Fahrenheit. We average the high and low temperatures. This blue line is actually our trend. We have a pretty strong increasing trend in the wintertime of almost 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade. And so whether or not you look at what our average temperature has been in our 30-year climate normal period, or you look at the trend line for the last 40 years, in both cases what you see is that 8 of our last 12 La Nina events, including 3 events that were just barely missing out on La Nina since 1980, have been above those lines, and then 4 of them have been below those lines. And so 2/3 of them have basically been above normal, 1/3 have been below normal. A couple of things to put out here is that these results are not statistically significant, so we don't have significant temperature increases on average for the region. And the second thing to point out is that our freeze days don't really change with La Nina. We tend to see about the same number when we're in La Nina versus years that we're not. But we do get a couple more days, 2 to 3 at each site, that are above 80 degrees compared to what we usually would get in a winter period. And so that's really where the increase tends to come from, except in a couple outlier years we had, like in 98, 99, 99, 2000, where it was generally just very warm. Another thing to point out is that in one of those kind of borderline years that we had a La Nina, we did back in 83, 84, immediately following one of the three strongest El Niños in 82, 83, we had one of those La Ninas that didn't quite meet the threshold. And that year we had 120 consecutive hours at Austin and 72 plus consecutive hours at San Antonio where temperatures remained below freezing back around Christmas in 1983. So just because we're in La Nina or in borderline La Nina conditions does not mean we cannot have cold temperatures, but the odds are slightly favored towards being above normal. Just kind of point out real fast, 6 of our counties have had a widespread freeze. It doesn't mean that these other spots have not had a widespread freeze so far this fall and now as we go into winter, but it just means that these are the areas where they had widespread freeze everywhere. But you can see that usually we get those in fall. And so we're going to be a little bit delayed for most of these locations of having a widespread freeze than what we normally are. But it looks like as we get towards the end of next week, there's a decent shot of getting a freeze to greater areas in just these 6 counties with the next front that we may have that's pretty strong. When we look at precipitation, precipitation is generally below normal 83% of the time, or 5 out of every 6 times for these events. And this is a statistically significant trend. This is something that has carried through pretty much across the board. There are some years where you don't have significant decreases, but there are a lot of years where you can see about half the time actually where we are significantly below normal precipitation-wise. Whereas we've only had 2, including the last La Nina event we had back in 11 and 12, that were above normal. This is actually the 2011-12 event was kind of a savior that helped us get through our historic drought of having an unexpected wetter than normal period that winter. So what does this mean? Well, for in terms of the number of precipitation days we have, it doesn't decrease them a lot. It just kind of decreases them by about 1 a month at each site. But when you look at our heavy precipitation days, although this is somewhat ironic because we may have 1 or 2 heavy precipitation days at Austin and San Antonio, may have 1 at Del Rio moving forward here this weekend, you can see that we typically have only about once a month on average precipitation days we receive over ½ an inch of rain or more. And that's about half what normally occurs in a La Nina, in a non-La Nina winter, which includes both El Nino and ENSO neutral cases. So again, we may see these events pretty early on here in the next week or so, but in general, it's not favored for them to occur. When we look at snowfall, you can see that one thing that does kind of permeate every single site is that even though we tend to see here in yellow about a 20 to 35% chance of receiving snow across our CWA every 3 to 5 years, you can see that during La Nina at every single site there is a slight decrease in those chances. And so, you know, for instance, Austin 1 out of every 4, San Antonio 1 out of every 5 or 6, and Del Rio 1 out of every 8 or so La Ninas will typically have snow. So the chances of getting snow are reduced. They're not 0 because, as you can see, back here in 1984 and 1985, that was a La Nina year where we actually had a lot of snow and is our snowfall record event for many locations. So it's not to say it can't happen, it's just to say the odds are not in its favor. For record snowfall events, you can see across the entire CWA, we've done a quick climatology of co-op sites, and as we get additional corrections, we'll correct this map moving forward in the coming months and years. But what you see here is that, in general, if you're in the coastal plains, the biggest event that we've had since, in many cases, some of these events are 1895, is anywhere from about 6 to 9 inches of snow, whereas as you move into the hill country, some of them have had up to 18 inches of snow or 15 inches of snow. Most areas in the CWA, the worst case scenario for a snow event will be around 9 to 12 inches. But when you look at when these occurred, these counties that are kind of shaded in this hashed area, about 14 of them, they all experienced their heaviest snowfall event back on January 12th to 13th, 1985, which was that La Nina event that occurred. And so, again, we have some other events that occur throughout the year, mainly in January, whereas a lot of times we're more likely to get snow in February. Our record events tend to happen in January, but you can see that for the most part it was that 1985 event that caused a lot of snowfall across the region. That is the record for most areas. In terms of severe weather, typically we have fewer weather watches or severe weather watches during strong La Nina events, but that trend does begin to reverse in February. So what you're seeing here is that, you know, generally in December and January we tend to have, you know, of those 10 strongest La Nina events versus El Nino events, you can see that we tend to only have about less than one a month, even in the strongest El Nino events. So we usually have less than that when we're in La Nina. But one thing to point out down here is that when you look at the strongest El Ninos versus the strongest La Ninas, it is much more favored to have severe weather in December and January during El Nino, whereas in February that trend begins to reverse. Over our southern counties, it's about a little bit more during El Nino. Over our northern counties, a little bit more during La Nina. You see a lot of active severe weather here in the mid-south, parts of southeast United States, and North Texas and Oklahoma during La Nina. And so it's not really favored to occur during La Nina, but the chances do go up relative to other years as we get into February and probably into early spring. Another thing to point out is that some of our stronger and longer track tornadoes that have occurred in this region and in other regions as well tend to occur during La Nina. And so that is something to keep in mind as well, that even if we may not get the event, if we did get the event, the chances that it could be a little bit stronger than it normally would be. And so in taking a look at severe weather, this again is research that Jason Runyon has done that some of you have seen before. But again, El Nino is really the favored period for getting more severe weather events, although you see that La Nina tends to have more severe weather than neutral years to some slight extent. But for the most part, La Nina is typically going to be pretty normal. So we know that after this weekend, we're going to be northwest flow for a while. Our chances of getting severe weather are not really that great even this weekend, except for possibly marginal conditions down in the coastal plains. So for the most part, we're predicting slightly below normal chances for severe weather moving through the middle of January, and then increasing them back to normal as we move through the second half of winter. For winter weather, again, you've seen that our biggest snowfall event for the most part has happened during a La Nina year. And it's also worth pointing out that during 2 of our last 4 quote-unquote weak La Ninas, or our weakest La Ninas, we did have measurable snow occurring in either Austin or San Antonio, and in 3 of our last 10 La Ninas of any strength. And so that just means that for the most part, it's about normal or slightly below normal where our winter weather would be expected. Again, most of these tend to occur in February when we do get those events, and so we've increased that slightly to get to normal odds for the second half of winter, but still expecting things to be below normal as La Nina continues to maintain itself over the next 6 weeks or so, but may not maintain itself through the entire winter to get it to be an official La Nina, and thus increasing chances back to normal. Again, remember that 12 to 18-inch snow event that occurred over parts of the region back in '85. For fire weather, obviously we had a couple fires this week over the region. As we get the wetting rains that occur this weekend, that threat should go down briefly, but we do expect that in general throughout the winter that threat is going to gradually increase as our fuels dry, because we did have a lot of rain last year and the year before, which should support some decent fuel growth. So if we don't get much rain in the second half of January and February as some dry fronts come through the region, that could begin to cause some problems, particularly if our drought is expanding. And then finally, for river flooding, the majority of our wettest winters occur in these blue years, which are El Ninos, 5 to 6 for both Austin and San Antonio, with the rest occurring in both ENSO neutral and La Nina years fairly equally. So, we're not really expecting a major river flood threat this winter. However, for this weekend, there is a small risk of some river flooding this weekend and early next week east of Interstates 35 and 37, where they may get a little bit more rain than some other areas. So having said that, just a couple of shameless plugs. Our spring outlook will either be on Thursday, March 2nd or March 9th as a backup at 2 p.m. We'll talk about how we're returning to ENSO neutral conditions, but you can see right now the odds are tilted towards a warmer than normal spring and near normal or slightly drier than normal spring as well. And then finally, one last shameless plug is for our Texas Weather Conference on March 3rd and 4th in Austin this year. Please feel free to attend that. The abstract deadline has been extended until December 16th, so if you're interested in presenting as well, we would love to have you present. And with that, we'll go ahead and take some questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or put them on the chat.